Hello there, everybody. Thank you for joining us again today. Terry Francis will be dropping in here in just a second as we tackle what's probably a pretty significant issue and one that will be challenging for he and I to talk about, one that may be something you're completely unaware of in regards to the work that takes place behind the scenes in the labor and efforts of those who share the gospel. We're going to be breaking down some of the pressures that get placed individually on those who are preachers, and hopefully toward the end of our discussion, opening up and sharing a bit more about the ways in which we popping in here in just a second or two. Looks like he is coming onto the camera. What we're going to be taking him. Oh, there he is. He's popped in.
Hey.
Hey. All right. So Terry, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Well, you know, I'm pretty busy. Seems like the schedule of life is faster than anticipated, especially as we settle into maybe the second phase of the work that happens in the relationship with an evangelist and the congregation. There's different seasons, and we talk about the honeymoon period and then the next phase, and really kind of moving into that next phase of the work here in Eastside. But let's hone into our topic for right now. We really kind of laid out some things that I think are incredibly important for those of us who preach to understand well. Remember, our focus here kind of in these conversations is to help prepare those who want to preach to better understand their work, help those who are trying to support preachers to understand the struggles and the triumphs that exist there, and individually help strengthen Terry and I. We deeply believe in the principle of iron sharpens iron, and this is one of the areas where he and I both have certainly struggled with in the past, will struggle with in the present and the future. And so, Terry, let's start breaking it down. We've got a pretty big list of things. And so what are we talking about? What are some of these pressures that preachers sometimes, if not most of the time, are kind of balancing in their lives?
Well, we're talking about depression, anxiety, fear, and I think one of the reasons we did this kind of project together was we know there's a lot of unspoken things that go on in the preacher's work, and they need to be talked about, partially because of we want better support for the preachers, but partially because we want members to just have a better maybe understanding of what preachers do and what they go through. And in the area of fear, anxiety, and depression, I think because we get up and we preach about peace and love and all these great biblical things for the members every week, they think that our lives are full of peace and love and calmness. And maybe they are at times, but there's a lot of turmoil that goes along with what we do. And we kind of want to pull back the curtain on that a little bit and expose that. There's a lot of stats that we've included in the copy here. For instance, 52% of ministers feel overworked, cannot meet their church's unrealistic expectations. About half. And let me say this, let me try to explain, and we got some preachers listening. Let me try to explain so people know. Everything that goes wrong at a congregation, your preacher believes is directly his fault, whether he's directly involved with it or not. His entire life revolves around the church. And so when the numbers go down, and by that I mean the attendance goes down, the contribution goes down, or when you're at a place like I've been where you have 150 on Sunday and 70 on Wednesday, all that you feel is your fault. You're the failure. It was your job to motivate, to encourage people to come back Wednesday, or it's your job to get them to give, or it's your job to get them to do their Bible lessons. It's your job to get them to sing out. It's your job to teach them how to pray better. Everything about that, every negative thing that could be said, every complaint that occurs within the congregation, your preacher takes personally
Yeah.
as a reflection of his inabilities.
Right. And it's not because someone came and told them it was their fault. It's not because of any standard dialogue of these are the expectations. This is the reality of how the information impacts those hearts, those who preach, my heart and Terry's heart. This is the reality of it, not the theory or, well, we had this job expectation list we put out there and here it all is. No, this is how it is. This is how the real pressures roll down the hill into our lives.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things is, so like, take the attendance thing. Nobody has to, we understand this. This is our job. So take me, for instance, I think about church stuff all the time. All the time. There's a joke in my house that Mondays are my day off. And let me tell you what that means. I don't go to my office. But I get emails, I study, I spent probably 7 hours yesterday because, like you, I'm extremely busy. I have a weekend meeting coming up and a 2-day preacher workshop. So I'm cramming everything in typical Terry Francis fashion. And then have other things I've got to take care of before I leave. And so I'm doing all that on my day off. Yeah. Okay. This church is what I do all the time. So I think about it all the time, analyze it all the time. Add to that, we're the guys that read the Rainier books and listen to the podcast about church growth and all the statistics. Nobody has to come up to me and say, man, Wednesday night's really discouraging because only 50% of our Sunday morning audience comes back. I see that. Yeah. I'm the one that realizes it's discouraging more than anybody else. And I'm the one, you don't have to tell me that. I'm the one that goes home and goes, man, why can't I get people to come back Wednesday night? And so what happens is, the majority of your preachers, again, you don't have to tell us the negative stuff. We see the negative stuff before you say anything. And we're carrying that baggage as a personal failure as a general rule. Add to that, let's just get this out of the way too, that if we fail too much, and regardless of whether you have a group of elders or a business meeting, too much failure and the church isn't growing and the church isn't where we think it needs to be, who's the first one to blame? Mm-hmm. Yeah. The preacher is.
Yeah, and that's not an unspoken thing. That becomes a spoken thing that then tears down into the various aspects of that man's life. It goes to his family, it goes to his kids, it goes to his relationships. And these are, again, a mixture of challenges that, unless we start talking about them openly, and laying it out coldly on the table, there's never going to be a better solution for it. It will continue to get swept under the rug. Terry and I both know preachers from earlier generations that, for lack of better terminology, quietly suffered through these instances. I'm thinking right now in my head of an evangelist who, because of some of these particular issues that we're talking about with depression, with grief, with mental struggles that are both physiological and emotional, made a mess of relationships with people whose basic desire was to help them make it better if they would have known. If they would have been comfortable sharing these things openly, they could have been a team together rather than unnecessarily wedged apart, over nothing, over foolishness in many cases. And there's a sliding, impact to the way in which an individual is affected by maybe one of the things we've listed. We've actually got stats that go across about 70 issues, 70 areas that all of them lend into this way. And I want to identify one thing. It's not a new issue. We've only highlighted basically our current time and maybe the things we've known from a little bit in the past. But remember, Paul wrote 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Terry just mentioned talking about reading some church growth material. And I read Rainier, Terry reads Rainier in that context because he's one of the guys who've done more research about it than others. Terry and I both know churches that are either dying or don't know that they're dead yet. They're not growing anymore. And I know the men who preach there. I know the families who were there, and I can't even fathom the pressure that they're feeling um, in the singular sense for that particular work, because that's them. They feel like they're failures at that point when that happens, even if they've done nothing wrong. The feeling is still there, and it's legitimate. It's a real impact, and that produces some real heavy depression that then comes out in the pulpit. You want to see an angry preacher who's you don't know why he's angry? That can be one of the reasons. He could be internally fighting a struggle that he hasn't developed the confidence to share with you, and now it's affecting the preaching work he's trying to do to encourage this flock to get better and to be stronger. And so we need to become, as we shift from what are we talking about to the practical side, first thing, recognize that there's a struggle there. This is a real problem with real consequences affecting real lives, and it's probably affected the person that you're preaching, that's preaching at the congregation you're part of, past, present, or will in the future. Even if they say, no, I'm good. Everything's great right now. It's a caveat, right now. Right now usually means that week. Not like 5 years.
Well, and the other problem is that the preachers don't feel like they can tell the members how discouraged they really are, because then you're just going to discourage them, which is just going to make it worse. And It's a cycle. It builds. And look, I'm going to go back before we move on to be aware. You understand something about those guys they're in those churches and just how this works. You're in a church that's not growing. You feel that's your fault. But then also, not only do you feel it's your fault, you feel that if you were to leave, because you're in a church that's not growing, you're in a classification of people that aren't necessarily hireable. And so now you feel stuck. And now you got to try to work it out, but you can't work it out because it's a church that's not growing. And truthfully, a lot of times, we talk about why churches don't grow. A lot of times it's because members aren't working and they're expecting you to do all the work. So then you work more, which takes you away from your family. I mean, this spirals out of control. And one of the things that's brought a lot of attention to this is in the last year and a half, 2 years, there's been several denominational ministers who have committed suicide, which seems to be out of sorts. How can this person who devotes their life to serving God take their own life? Because there's a lot of depression that goes along with this. It's just a very real problem. And so, again, going back, members need to be aware that it's a problem, even if it doesn't act like there is. The reality is that over half of all preachers feel like they're not measuring up to the job that they're supposed to do.
Yeah. And
over half.
Again, just to kind of highlight and get specific about it, that guy that's preaching for the church that's dying, he puts together his resume and it says, what kind of successes do I have? When I moved here, the church was 30 members. That was 10 years ago. We have 32 members now. And that's because my family had 2 children,
Right.
And that's that guy's internal thoughts. Like, if you're working in an industry anywhere and you're filling a spot opening up, are you going to hire that guy? 10 years? What is the unrealistic expectation and what's the fruit of your work? Well, the fruit of his work has nothing about that. God gave increase as God determined on his end. He may be literally the very best speaker on the planet with the eloquence of Apollos, the insight of Paul, and there are factors that do not connect to that whatsoever. But he doesn't fit some arbitrary, unnecessary standards, and now he feels there's nothing I can do. I got to stay here and continue to toil in obscurity and then cover up the pain of my heart.
And you add to that, by the way, Phil, that most people don't know this too. Preachers are aware of this. There's a window of when churches want you. Mm-hmm. It's roughly about 30 years, 30 to 35 to about 50. You may stretch that a little longer if you have younger kids at home because kids are a bonus. But if you're over 50 and your kids have left home, or if you're not married, or if you don't have kids, you're in this group already that it's tough for people to even look at you, because the ultimate package for a preacher is a guy who has proven himself with growth, with huge numbers, has 3-4 kids at home that can help our young people get along, is a good speaker, and is that optimal age. You don't match that, then all of a sudden guys start going, man, I'm not hireable. And And you get to an age where your fear is that you're going to go to that. And I'm just being honest with people so they understand your only choice is to go to that church that has 30 members that the guy just got fired because he'd been there 10 years and hadn't grown. And going there, you're not going to have a good shot at growing it either because of the demographics, but that's your only choice. That's your fear.
Yeah.
And all of that, and by the way, over half feel underpaid. That probably goes along with that. So all of that together puts this enormous burden emotionally, mentally on the preacher. And so again, goes back to be aware of all that. Understand what pressures these guys feel. And along that line, one of the stats that's up there that kind of goes along with what we talked about recently is 84% of ministers desire to have a close fellowship with someone they can trust and confide with. Two things. Number one, we all want that because we want to talk about our fears and anxieties. But the other thing is, notice it says they desire to have that, which means 84% don't feel they have that with anybody. Mm-hmm. They're looking for it, but they don't have that. And because it's very rare to find, especially a person within your own congregation, that you can be honest about and say, man, I'm really struggling. I'm very discouraged. Yeah. And then not take that as a sign of your own weakness.
Right. Or you're also equally afraid, like you mentioned before, that your anxiety will become theirs. And that they will feel the weight of your fears and it will drop down. What I love about Paul's comment here to that church at Corinth is not this ideal happy place. He's not writing to it, but he says, look, this is how it is. This is where my heart is. I need you to know that about me and where I'm at. And so one of the things I want to highlight very specifically when we talk about being aware of the problem, I want my brethren, whether they preach or not, to know that this is probably an issue that your evangelist struggles with, whomever he is, young or old, new or long behind the plow. He's going to have this emotional distraughtness going on in his heart about his work. And it will impact, like we mentioned before, it can lead to depression, feelings of significant guilt. And I'm not even talking about a bad day. I'm talking legitimate clinical depression that someone really ought to be talking to a professional about in order to unpackage and take some of those stressors off. But and here's a practical thing. How many preachers do you know struggle with their weight? Why do you think preachers struggle with eating too much?
Yeah.
I struggle with mine. I'm giant tied, so I can hide it. But it's not hidden from me. I know that it's there. I also know why it's there. And that's because for me, I compensate for the stress by picking up unhealthy foods because they taste good. That's just, if it tastes good, I eat it, and then I eat more because it made me feel good. It's a cycle, but I'm needing that, emotional release.
And add to that because then we're depressed and we think the solution is to work harder, that we immerse ourselves in our work, which doesn't leave us time to do anything physically to balance out the depressive eating. I mean, it's again, all this is connected. Right. Matthew Bassford just commented, I think the issue of ministers not having anyone to trust or confide in is particularly significant. My impression is that most brotherhood preachers, myself included, don't open themselves up completely to anyone they worship with. Candor in a preacher tends to be a recipe for having to move a lot. And I'll say, I think you're right. And even if you're not right, that's what we're afraid of, Matt, is that if I am too open and too honest about everything, then I'm going to have to move again. And quite frankly, we hate moving. Like the majority of us hate moving. We did not preach so that we could move every 5 years. I want to dispel that myth out there. We like stability like everybody else does.
Right. And here's another way to think through the issue. And again, this is reaching to those who are not directly involved in preaching. Take the list there and change where it says ministers to the thing that you do for a living. And ask yourself if you said, that's great, I want to do that.
Yeah.
just simply in that way. You know, you're a teacher. Yeah, that's great. I want to do that. You're a police officer. Yeah, that's great. I want to do that. We all talk openly about the struggles that police officers have, nurses have, teachers have, caregivers have. Um, Life's not rosy across the board, but we feel like it's important in this area and to get a little bit more openness because there isn't. And Terry and I are both in a position where we feel like we can do that. Both because of our experience and our local situations, we feel like now's a great time to kind of open it up and discuss it more clearly, and deal with some of the solution models that are there, and really try to prevent deeper problems for ourselves and for others.
But let me say this, and then we need to get to the next solution phase. Even us opening up publicly on Facebook brings a certain level of fear and anxiety with it, because there's been a lot of things that, not just this subject, but that we've dealt with, and that I've dealt with even on my own private personal page, about leadership and being somewhat critical. And those are conversations that need to be had. Yet I've even gotten messages from members, not preachers, but members and elders saying, hey, it's okay to feel that way, but these aren't the kind of things we talk about. And so understand that part of the reason why this has continued on is because nobody's been willing to talk about it. We're talking about it, but it doesn't bring another set of anxiety, another level to us about, okay, well, if this doesn't work out where I'm at, I may have dug a hole I can't get out of. And I think that's something, by the way, we do that not for ourselves. We're really, at least from my standpoint, we're doing this for a lot of preachers who don't feel comfortable talking about this. We have people that reach out to us, just so people know, privately, who preach, who say, one person said to me about one thing that we did, it's like you're reading my diary. It's like you're exposing how I really feel. And we're doing this work on the Do the Work page for those folks, to help out our brothers who can't speak right now. But to move on to the second thing, and I wanted to kind of say this, the second thing you can do besides being aware is to pray. And I want to tell you that one of the most powerful influences in my life in Collierville, where I was for 11 years, there was a guy there named William Teal, and he was a police officer, retired Army. And William, on numerous occasions, would meet me at the back of the auditorium as soon as the invitation song was over, put his arm on my shoulders and say, come with me. And we'd go to a classroom and he would pray with me, just the two of us. And I can't tell you how many times, not because he knew anything, just because William was a man of prayer, and there were times where he could tell I needed prayer. And so I can't tell you the number of times I was struggling, and that was almost providential that William would come in and say, hey, let's go pray. Let's go pray. So anyway, that's kind of, I think one of the things to do is not tell your preacher you're praying for him, but go and pray with him.
Right.
Have him over for dinner and say, I just wanted to pray with you and your family tonight, because I know what you face is difficult. If you're a member, you may not realize the impact that could have on your evangelist.
Yeah. One of the elders at J. Weston Road, when I was there, and I was there for 13 years, would randomly stop in on the week. And then I learned it wasn't random. At first I thought it was like, hey, they would just stop by. And then I figured out that it was intentional on his part. And pretty much once a week, within a window of about plus or 5 minutes at a certain time of the day, they would stop by and we would talk about anything other than the work of the church and preaching. And we got to spend time together, and he, at the close of it, would always take a moment again to enter into prayer for the both of us, for his role, for mine, and then go about his business and go be in who he was. And he was a far more complex and genuine person than most folks saw, because we only got to see him in certain boxes. You would see him as a quiet yet stable elder, or you'd see him play, try and sing along bluegrass records and stuff like that. But I saw him in all other kinds of ways. And that's a great way to get practical with support in that sense of connecting well. Back in the initial iterations of the covenant of God, and we're talking back, like Numbers 19, when they're laying out again the relationship between the Israelites and the Levites, and there's all this financial connectedness. That ends up to being about a 33% relationship shift financially back to those Levites, tax of that much money. Well, you think about it in a simple way. What ways can we be of equivalent support today beyond our free will contribution and making sure that financially that's there? Being a practical support to the arms of an evangelist is really a simple thing if we're willing to get there and lean in a little bit, offer that hug, take them with them. Oh, we're going to go out to dinner tonight. Your family's coming. We're going to go here. How often is it the opposite, where someone visits the congregation and the expectation is that the preacher is going to take them to lunch? Turning the table around to the visiting preacher or the local preacher, maybe treat the local preacher like the gospel meeting guy is another way to think about it. Because it's not about the food. It's about the time shared and the conversation connected.
Yeah, and as we talk about support, a couple things to add to that besides just the prayer. I wanted to add this, especially if you have a younger preacher with young kids. One of the things that you may not realize or think about is the fact that chances are your preacher has no family where he lives. I have family with me because I moved them into my house because they're the age where that's what's needed. But that also means that they're not really able to do things necessarily for me in a support role. So when you think about, I think you think about the story of Aaron and Hur holding up Moses' arms. What are some ways you could hold up the arms of your preacher in a figurative sense? So if you have a young guy with young kids, why not go up to him, you and your wife, one night and say, hey, Friday night, we'll take care of your kids. Y'all need to go out on a date. Yeah. You have no idea what that would do for the preacher and his wife, who, if they have no family nearby, they have to pay for a sitter and they don't really have that opportunity. And so think of things along those lines for support that maybe you don't think of normally.
Right. That's a great avenue of service for young college kids, older high school kids, young marrieds, elderly families as well, depending on the demographics of the kids. That really doesn't require anything else other than time. There's not this big significant barrier to participation. And you share a little bit of time that way, that releases the burden and opens up a little bit more opportunity to spiritually invigorate, guess what? Better preaching, better leadership. Because if you can balance those things out, the things that you actually want, we want the best preacher we can get. All right, make your current preacher better. That's a much better outcome than, well, we're kind of tired of this guy, and so we're just going to shuffle him out with a different new guy, and then he'll give us his 2 years worth of best sermons, and then we'll kick him down the road, and we'll have another guy who gives us his 2 years worth of best sermons. How about make that 2-year guy the best guy ever?
What's really interesting about that, by the way, is in other businesses or in other careers, that's what they do is if you're struggling in the area, they attempt to train you and to build you up to be successful. In churches, when we think a guy needs help, we fire him or we ask him to leave or we just abandon him. What are some ways you can support him? And to leadership, if you think a guy is struggling, what are some ways you can support him? How can you help him get better? If he, and we've talked about before, if a guy's struggling with evangelism, send him to go work with a guy for a week that's really good in evangelism. Right. If he's got, in other words, support could come in a lot of ways, and probably in the area of anxiety and fear and depression, we're talking about more non-career related things, more like things such as, hey, why not take him out to lunch? Why not spend time with him? I got to tell you, in the dark days of my preaching career, I not only was full of depression and fear and anxiety, but I felt completely isolated and lonely. And there were days that I probably just wished somebody cared enough to stop by and say, hey, let's go grab a bite to eat. And a gesture such as that would have been a tremendous benefit. And yet what happened was I sat isolated in an office all day long. And understand something. I sat in an office because during those dark times, you don't feel adequate enough to go out in the community and do much. So it is a cycle again. It's all spirals, and you sit there and you get more depressed. And it could be your phone call, your prayer, your lunch spontaneously that makes the difference. And by a spontaneous lunch of support, I do not mean to go and then to gripe about everything that's wrong, or to tell them what you don't like that's going on, or how you're mad about what the elders did, or how you don't like the teacher, or you didn't like his lesson. How about just going to lunch and not complaining at all?
Yeah. You could survey it this way. If you look over the conversations you've had with a man who preaches where you assemble and you worship, and the only times that you have interacted have been when you're upset at what you think he's doing or not doing, then there is an area for growth. I don't know what the problem is. It could be him. It could be the preacher. Sometimes the preachers are their worst problems, like us ourselves. Like we make our own, hills to die upon. But it's a good way to kind of break it down and say, hey, wait a minute. Here's the area. Am I the problem? Is it the preacher the problem? Is it an us problem, or the two of us really just haven't spent enough time together to get to know one another? So go invest. You'll generally be surprised if you're willing to take the time to slowly open up the cage that probably is that preacher's heart. You're not going to get it in the first 5 minutes, no matter how hard you try. He's probably spent 20 years locking it down.
One thing I will say too is don't wait until your preacher's moving to tell him how much you like him.
Yeah, because at the same time, when the preacher's moving, he's already hearing how happy people are for him to go.
Yeah,
and probably had already heard that how happy they would be for him to leave in progression up to that point. And these are the contributors again to the stress, the anxiety on the internal side. And if you're not figuring out, they should just toughen up, get a little stronger.
Yeah.
I know a lot of men who preach, and though their personal lifestyles and certain interests are very different, they are generally very resilient. How do I know that? They're still preaching. If they've been preaching more than 5 years, they've toughened up enough. There needs to be a shift there.
Another thing real quick, and I know we need to end it. Another thing I just thought of was, just real quick, and I'm sure you'll amen this, I have over time gotten written cards in the mail thanking me for sermons or just the work in general. Another easy, simple, but very encouraging thing somebody could do if you want to support your minister.
Yeah. A Facebook message, a text, a phone call, a genuine, specific thank you because you addressed this specific thing in your sermon, or wow, I had never seen that before, or even if you didn't catch anything specific in the sermon, appreciate their work and their effort in the ways that are genuine and not just superficial. Because you could shift the table just a little bit and think about this. If we approached our prayer life with the same level of vanity that we approach our relationship with those who preach, do you think God would be praised and happy and seeing that as a sweet aroma? Or he would say, y'all are lukewarm, get out of here, because you don't actually care. There's some real dysfunction. And again, like I said before, sometimes the preacher is part of the problem. Sure. Because we haven't been enabled, or we haven't been encouraged or trained in such a way to show and accept leadership in that way. And like we talked about before, we don't always deal with criticism well.
Right.
You just don't know what you're talking about. Well, maybe they do. Maybe we don't know what we're talking about. Those are all valid and true facts as well.
Well, and you said some people think, well, we just need to get over it. And what I will say about that too is we do probably, but not just preachers, but everybody gets upset about a lot of things that probably we could do better and get over with. And what I mean by that is, hey, we're just like you. We're human.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same baggage we all carry.
Yeah.
And if we would be more understanding, and I guess I think about Philippians 2, 3, and 4, about the need to put the interest of others ahead of our own, and to seek what's best for other people. To the non-preachers out there, I would just simply say to you, I hope that maybe some of the things we talked about will help you see that from the preacher's standpoint a little differently, and maybe you'll put your preacher's interest ahead of your own before you maybe complain or say some things, or the way you act, and practice that passage in regards to the guy that's working with the church you're at.
Yeah, and here's a suggestion to think about those conversations that need to happen that can be shifted in a different way. Rather than going with, I didn't like it when you did or said X, which is obvious by your demeanor. Say, help me understand. What did I miss? What did I not know that was driving your decision to bring this topic, this subject to the top of the table so that I can help you address it? Maybe there's something that person is so much more effective. And I'll give a simple illustration. You and I have those extrovert tendencies. So we get to connect with extrovert people. And so our preaching often is very extroverted in that same way. Some people don't function that way. And so the introvert who doesn't have that same skill set can go help someone I will never reach in these areas, especially with preacher-to-preacher relationships. Maybe we're not going to be able to reach him. Terry and I can't help that guy because their makeup and stuff is so different. But another guy who's somewhere on the edge in the middle, boom, he's the right guy. Maybe that's you, random brotherhood listener who's watching Terry and I talk. That's about what we budgeted time-wise for this discussion, even though I think Terry and I probably could spend the next 3 hours kind of unpacking a number of these related, especially the statistics. We put those up there just to give a hint of the struggles. There's a lot more that goes into it. These are the things that produce depression, they produce grief, they produce anxiety. And the neat thing about this particular list is many of those things are manageable. We can adjust the circumstances to lower the pressure and raise the success rate, in a lot of ways, especially if we become more intentional and saying, here's the problem. Here's our solution package. The preacher's part of the solution package. So are the elders. So are the sheep congregationally. Terry, any last comments for us?
No, we're actually over time. I just want to tell everybody that's watching, appreciate you continue to do that. If you would share this on your own personal page, and if you happen to be watching and you've not liked the Do the Work page, go ahead and like that so you can see when we go live in the future.
Yeah, and I'll add this. If you have a suggestion for a solution that Terry and I weren't aware of or didn't mention, drop it in the comments. We want to get better. We want to improve spiritually and relationally with our families, with our brethren, and with our God. Thanks, everybody. I hope that we're doing something that's good for you. Terry, give us your last comments and we'll shut down.
Just look forward to it next week. And again, thanks for tuning in, and just pray for your preacher and be a support to him.
Bye, everybody.